Questions for faith. Number 4. Why does God allow suffering? Now, the Bible has quite a lot to say on the subject of suffering. And I think in the Old Testament, certainly, there is no book that says more about suffering than the book of Job. It's a wonderful book, and it tells us a lot about suffering. And the secret of the book of Job is that Job never knew. He never knew why he was suffering. We know because we can read the whole story, but Job didn't know. But he got to a point where he said, I'm going to trust God. I don't know everything, but I'm going to trust God. Now, before I go any further, I think I should explain that I'm not really qualified to speak about this subject. I've had a happy marriage, and I've been a primary school teacher for many years. I've taught in different countries around the world. Here I am having a picnic with my class in our back garden in Kenya. So in many ways, I'm really not someone who can talk very much about suffering from first-hand experience. There are people who've suffered much more than I have in this life. Now, this question, why does God allow suffering? I think all Christians, sooner or later, are going to come across it. And I think the first thing I want to say about suffering is that it shouldn't be ignored. Some Christians just want to be happy all the time and have a very positive way of looking at things, and so they don't like the subject of suffering, especially young Christians. They might say, well, this subject is really rather depressing. It's not a very happy subject. Let's not talk about it. But I think that we should think seriously about this issue. Suffering usually waits for us towards the end of our life. That's when suffering really comes along. But the shadow of suffering will be cast across every path, I think, sooner or later. And when suffering comes, of course, it brings doubt. It brings questions, awkward questions, difficult questions. The second thing I want to say about suffering is that we should not exaggerate it. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean that fundamentally suffering is an individual problem. Just because lots of people are suffering doesn't make it any bigger. If only one person in the whole world was suffering, we would still have the same problem. And although we can say, well, we sympathize, we can say that to someone who's suffering, really, the truth is that we suffer on our own. We can't really share out the suffering or take away someone else's suffering. We can't usually do that. So, 3 things. It shouldn't be ignored. It should not be exaggerated. But thirdly, it cannot be completely explained. There is a mystery to suffering, and the Bible does not give us a simple, easy answer to this question. And so I think that although it tells us quite a lot about suffering, we will not get the whole answer, not in this life. But if we can hang on to what the Bible does tell us, well, perhaps we will be able to cope when suffering comes. Now, why is suffering a problem for Christians? I'm not sure that it's a problem for every other religion. I'm not so sure that it's a problem for people who don't have any religious faith, but it's particularly a problem for Christians. Now, why should that be? Well, first of all, we believe three things about God, and you need to believe all three things. If you're a Christian, you should believe them, and if you do, then you will have a problem. And the first thing is that we believe in one God. If you believe in lots of different gods, well, then some of them may be good and some of them may be bad, and the ones in the middle, maybe they can't make up their minds. And so therefore there is bound to be suffering. These gods are not going to agree with each other. And if you think back to ancient Greece, human suffering, well, that's the sort of thing that happens when different gods disagree with each other. And I think in those parts of the world where they do still believe in different gods, I don't think this question of suffering really comes up very much. But we believe in one God, and we believe in an almighty God. You see, if God is weak, if he can't really do anything about human suffering, well, I suppose he could look down from heaven and say, "Oh, I do feel sorry for you. Oh, yes, you are suffering, aren't you? Isn't that awful? But there's absolutely nothing I can do about it." But that is not the God of the Bible, because in the Bible we read about a God who is almighty. Thirdly, we believe in a God who is love. Because if God is hate, well, then there's no problem. If God enjoys torturing people and making human beings suffer, well, then there's no problem. Of course there's going to be suffering. But the Bible says that God is love. It says that very clearly. Now, how do we reconcile all of these different ideas, these three different ideas about God? Is it the case that we humans are kinder and better than God? That we have more compassion and more sympathy for human suffering than God has? No, I don't think that's true. I do think that we might have some silly ideas and wrong ideas about what it means when we say that God is love. Perhaps our idea of love is a rather mushy and sentimental sort of thing, and God's love isn't really like that. Another problem, of course, is that the word love, well, it's even been used by McDonald's, and so the word love can mean all kinds of things, and sometimes it doesn't mean very much. So when we say that God is love, what does that really mean? But Christians do believe these three things about God, and that is why we have a problem. If there is one God, and he is almighty, and he is loving, then why is there so much suffering in this world? Now, what is the cause of suffering? What really actually makes suffering? And we need to look at three different answers. The first two answers have been given by philosophers and theologians and thinkers over the years, and the last answer is the Bible's answer. The first answer that I want to think about is the imperfection of the world. Putting it very simply, when God made the world, he did a bad job. Now, I am not very good at DIY. My wife is always asking me to fix things or to repair things around the house, and I'm not very good at it. So I do have some sympathy for this idea, but it doesn't really fit in with what the Bible says, because the Bible very clearly says that when God made the world, he said, wow, that is a good job. I've done a good job. And I don't think you could say that about a world that was imperfect, that had all kinds of faults in it, things that would lead to suffering. So I can't really agree with that first statement, that suffering is due to the imperfections of the world. The second excuse, or reason, if you like, that's been given for suffering is the ignorance of men. In other words, we are not smart enough. Human beings are not clever enough. If we all had higher IQs, if we were all super intelligent, then there wouldn't be so much suffering. So, what do we think about this? I think that, yes, sometimes it's true to say that ignorance or lack of knowledge can cause suffering. Yes, that's true. I think that certain types of knowledge, especially medical knowledge, can reduce suffering and in some cases remove it. But I think it's too much of a generalization to say that suffering is caused by human ignorance. And if we knew more, if we were all much more intelligent, if we all had PhDs, then there would be less suffering. I don't think that's true. I don't think that's borne out by human experience. The third answer to this question is the Bible's answer, and it's very simple. What is the cause of suffering? And the Bible says sin, wrongdoing, man's disobedience. That is where all suffering comes from. If you trace back all human suffering, it's due to sin. And if humans stopped sinning, then we wouldn't have suffering. Suffering would never have even come to the human race if it hadn't been for sin. That seems to me to be the Bible's answer. But we have to ask, whose sin? Whose sin? I was on a coach once down in southwest England, and I was sitting next to a lady, and we were talking about all kinds of things, and she told me that after her baby had died, someone told her, your baby is dead because you sinned, because you are a sinner, because you did something wrong. What a terrible thing to say to a mother who's grieving the death of her child. We need to be very careful when we talk about sin and suffering and how they are connected. You see, if you look at things from a kind of intellectual angle, then life can be a bit of a comedy. But if you are one of those people who has emotions, and you are an emotional person, then life can be a tragedy. And there are real feelings involved here with this question of suffering, especially if you're suffering yourself or if there's somebody in your family who's suffering. And we need to be very, very sensitive and very careful when we talk about the connection between sin and suffering. So, let's consider these three sources of sin that can lead to suffering. First of all, our own sins. Is it possible that you are suffering right now because of things that you have done? Maybe they caused suffering straight away. Maybe the suffering came later. Well, of course, there are many people who are suffering because of their sin. The prisons around the world are full of people who've done wrong, and they're suffering as a result. Or maybe there's a man who's been drinking too much and now he's got cirrhosis of the liver. Maybe there was a lady who thought that high heels were very stylish and now she's got all kinds of back problems. What you do can lead to suffering later on. If we make foolish decisions, if we make decisions without careful prayer, without considering the teaching of the Bible, well, I'm sorry, but you probably are going to suffer as a result. That's not a cruel thing. That's not something which gives me any pleasure to say. I think it's just common sense that foolish decisions lead to suffering. And God gave us the most delicate and amazingly sophisticated machine, the human body. Is there any machine more amazing, more complicated, more delicate than the human body? And God gave us our bodies to look after properly. And if we don't look after that amazing machine properly, well then of course we mustn't be surprised when suffering comes along. Blessed is the man who does not walk in the counsel of the wicked, or stand in the way of sinners, or sit in the seat of mockers. And very often we are led astray. We make bad decisions because we're in bad company. And we ignore this teaching at the beginning of the book of Psalms. And the Bible is absolutely clear that we will reap what we sow. I don't think the Bible could be any more clear about this. Some time ago, there was a dating agency which was aimed at married people. It was actually encouraging married people to have adultery in their lives, to commit adultery. And if you do that sort of thing, don't be surprised when you find yourself in a divorce court, when you find yourself suffering financially and in other ways as well. But if you fail to do this, you will be sinning against the Lord. You may be sure that your sin will find you out. That's from the book of Numbers. Now, sometimes there's a person who themselves, perhaps they've tried to live a very good life, but they are affected by the sins of other people. War is the most extreme example of this, where somebody who perhaps has led a very good life can experience terrible suffering because of war. Aggression, violence, all can lead to terrible suffering for other people. At the moment, there are many in the world who are hungry. And it's very, very tempting to say, well, that's all God's fault. God's supposed to be in charge, and he shouldn't allow that. But God made a promise, and he's kept it. He made that promise in chapter 8. And he made it to Noah. Do you remember about seed time and harvest time not ever coming to an end? And God has given the whole world enough food. There is enough food in the world now to feed everybody if we shared it out properly. It's not God's fault if that food is not being shared out properly. It's the result of human selfishness. And while a large part of the world's population are starving or on the brink of starvation, obesity, being overweight, is a huge health problem in many developed countries. Now we need to remember that Job, even though he was suffering terribly, did not say that it was God's fault or that God was doing a bad job or anything like that. In all this, Job did not sin by charging God with wrongdoing. Thirdly, there is one more source of sin, the sins of Satan. Sin extends beyond the human race, and therefore some human suffering is not the result of human beings at all, but it may be the fault of Satan. Now, some people who are not Christians might say, well, there you go again, blaming everything onto the devil. Everything you can't understand, you just blame it onto him. Well, that's not really my point here. What I'm trying to say is this: does the Bible talk about someone called Satan, a highly intelligent being who hates God, who is trying to fight God? If such a being does exist, is it logical to assume that human suffering, or some human suffering, might be attributable to Satan? Well, I think that's true. I think that is a logical conclusion from what the Bible tells us about Satan. So I don't think I'm trying to escape the issue by saying that some sin, some suffering rather, is due to Satan. I think that really does fit in with the teaching of the Bible. But we must be careful, because I think a lot of the suffering in the world, probably the majority of the suffering in the world, have nothing to do with Satan at all. It is our own fault, it is our own sin, it is our own foolishness that is causing most of the suffering. And so we shouldn't blame everything on the devil, we shouldn't blame everything on Satan. Perhaps he is responsible for some suffering, but in all probability, not very much. Now we can answer the question, why does God allow me to suffer? First of all, for my own sins. Secondly, for the sins of other people. And thirdly, for Satan's sins. And we're going to have to give a different answer to each question. So let's think about the first one first. Why does God allow me to suffer for my own sins? C.S. Lewis once said that God whispers to us in our pleasures, but he shouts to us in our pain. And sometimes the only way God can speak to you, the only way he can speak to those who don't want to listen, who don't want to hear what he's saying, is to allow them to suffer. So why does God allow me to suffer because of someone else's sins? Well, this is a bit more difficult, but I think I can tell you the answer. I'll try to anyway. You see, we could all live on a desert island. Everybody could be completely separate. God could have made a world in which we all lived on our own little separate desert island. We never came across any other human being. And in that way, nobody would be able to hurt anyone else. If we lived in a world like that, then no one would make anyone else suffer because we were all separate, quite apart from everyone else. But do you really think that that is what a family is like. When God made human beings, I think he wanted a bigger family. And so therefore God says, well, I'm going to have to put these people together. I'm going to have to put these people together so that they can love each other, so that they can help each other. But if you put people together, there's also the possibility that they're going to hurt each other, that they're going to be horrible and do nasty things to each other. Well, what would you do in that situation? Would you all prefer to be completely separate so that you never got hurt? Well, yes, but then you never learn to love anyone else. Why does God allow me to suffer because of Satan's sins? Now, this, I think, is the most difficult question of all, and I'm not really sure that I've got a proper answer for you. I think this one is going to be a bit of a mystery. I'm really speculating for this one. But I do believe in God's providence. I do believe that God knows what he's doing, and therefore he would not allow human suffering if there wasn't a very good reason. He wouldn't allow Satan to cause human suffering if there wasn't a good reason for it. And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. That's what Paul says in Romans chapter 8. So clearly suffering is part of all things. All things are pretty wide. It doesn't really leave anything out, does it? And so therefore suffering must be because God is working for our good, even in the case of Satan causing suffering. Now I'm going to give you two illustrations. The first illustration is from my own life. I remember as a child, that's me on the right, by the way, learning to swim. And I wasn't very good at it. And one day I was in the sea and my mother said, swim to me. Come on, see if you can swim all the way to me. And I swam a little bit, and then I swam a bit more, and I didn't seem to be getting any closer. And that's when I realized that my mother was actually walking backwards. She was actually walking away from me. And I remember at the time, I was very angry. I thought that was very unfair. And just as people say, well, it's unfair that God allows Satan to cause human suffering. But later, I think much later actually, I realized that my mother was doing this because she loved me. She wanted me to be a strong swimmer. She thought, well, maybe if he's really good at swimming one day, that might actually save his life. That's why she did it. I once heard of a minister called Tulip Scott. David Pawson talked about him in one of his sermons, Tulip Scott. And Tulip Scott used to say to people a rather strange question. He used to say to them, do you see anything unusual about my face? Do you see anything strange about it? People used to look at his face and they would say, no, nothing unusual about your face. He said, well, yes, there is actually. Because when I was a child, I had smallpox. And my mother took some rope and she tied up my hands very tightly, and it was painful. And she tied up my legs as well, so that I couldn't scratch myself. Because she knew that if I scratched myself when I had smallpox, I could make terrible marks, terrible scars on my face. And I was crying and I was angry. But it was only later that I realized that she had done this because she loved me. And that's how I came to understand suffering, the kind of suffering that God allows Satan to do in this world. Now I want to say a little bit about suffering and the next world. We have to face the terrible prospect that some people will suffer much more in the next world than they ever suffered in this world. Now, you may not like that idea. You might say, well, that's absolutely horrible. But I have to say, I believe that's what the Bible teaches. That the suffering in the next world could actually be much worse. I don't think it's pie in the sky to say that for Christians, the next world will be a place where there is no suffering. I'm not sure that I have a clear idea of what it's going to be like in heaven. I think it will be so amazing we can't really imagine it. But there won't be any suffering there. And when we look back on this life, on the suffering in this life, it will be like a bad dream. When you wake up in the morning, you know you've had a bad dream, but you can't even remember it. And very quickly it just fades away. That's what suffering will be like when we look back on it, when we're in heaven. Do you know The Shores of Avalon, that wonderful, wonderful, beautiful song by The Seekers? I've listened to it so many times. A world where there's no suffering. A world where there's almost no memory of suffering. That is what heaven will be like. Paul says this in 2 Corinthians, "For our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all." And in Romans 8 he says, "I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us." And that was Paul. He'd been imprisoned, he'd been shipwrecked, he'd been beaten, he'd been stoned. Paul was somebody who knew about suffering. Now, the biggest question of all is one I should really have started with. Why did God the Father allow his own Son to suffer? Sometimes in this life we suffer because it's our own fault, because we've done something stupid, because we've done something wrong. But Jesus never sinned. Jesus never deserved the suffering that he had. Now I want to talk about the betrayal barrier. And I don't claim this as original. This is an idea from R.T. Kendall, a very famous American Bible teacher. Whenever something really awful happens, especially when a person close to us dies, it's very easy for us to be angry with God. And in that situation, we can say all kinds of things. I remember a lady called Maggie talking about the death of her father. And whenever she prayed, she found herself shouting at God and telling God how unfair he'd been. Job accepted his suffering. And I think that really all of us should try to come to the point that Job came to. "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will depart. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised." That verse is often read at funerals. And I think Job is saying that God has every right to take away pleasures, to take away loved ones. He gave them to us in the first place. Now, when something awful happens, when a loved one, a dear member of our family or a dear friend is taken away, Christians come across the betrayal barrier. It's a bit like the sound barrier. Maybe, I think it was about 70 or 80 years ago, they thought it was impossible to fly faster than the speed of sound. Lots of jets do it today, but they used to think that it just would be impossible because the shock of breaking the sound barrier would cause the aeroplane to break up and fall out of the sky. And it was a great advance in the science of aeronautics when one day somebody managed to break the sound barrier and survive. And they had to strengthen the aeroplane and do all kinds of special modifications to the aeroplane so that it would break the sound barrier safely. And when Christians go through suffering, perhaps when somebody in your family dies, it's a terrible strain. It's like hitting a barrier. It's awful and painful and difficult. And in that situation, yes, many Christians do get angry with God. Some sadly lose their faith and say, well, I used to believe in God, but then this awful thing happened and now I don't. Now I don't say I'm a Christian anymore. Why does God allow suffering? Why doesn't he just stop it? It's a very, very difficult question. I think that perhaps he wants us to grow up. I think that suffering is a test and he wants us to pass that test. I remember as a child, one day my mother gave me a bicycle and I didn't know how to ride a bike. And she made me sit on the bicycle. I wasn't very happy about that. And she gave me a really big push. And I managed to go a short distance and then the bicycle started wobbling and I fell off and I hurt myself. And this happened again. And this happened again. In fact, I think it happened maybe 4 or 5 times. And I really was badly hurt. I remember looking down at my leg and there was blood running down my sock. And I didn't want to get on that bicycle. I was frightened of it. I hated it. But my mother knew best. And she said, well, come on, you've got to get back on. So I did. And then I started cycling. I understood how to control it. And I rode round and round and round, laughing. I was so happy. I could go faster than I thought possible. It was such great fun. I'm so glad I learned how to ride a bike. Perhaps that might help you to understand why God allows suffering. God bless you. Goodbye.